Michael lived in a neighborhood that many people only dreamed about. It was a place where the streets were lined with tall trees that gave shade in the summer, and a golden glow in the autumn, the kind of place where children rode their bikes without worry, where dogs barked happily in the yards, and where people waved at each other while picking up their mail. It was peaceful, it was calm, and it felt safe. His mansion stood at the end of a quiet road, larger than the other homes but never flashy. It had a wide lawn, a fountain in the middle, and tall iron gates that opened smoothly when his car approached. To some it looked like a palace, but to Michael it was simply home. He had worked hard for it. He had earned every stone, every window, and every brick with years of dedication to the law. Michael was a judge, not just any judge, but one who carried respect. When he walked into a courtroom, the people listened. His words carried weight, but outside the courtroom he was gentle, soft-spoken, and polite. He enjoyed long evenings on his porch with a cup of tea, reading thick books, or sometimes just listening to the wind move through the trees. It was the kind of life he valued most, quiet and steady. The neighbors admired him, though most only knew him from a distance. They called him fair. They called him wise, and they called him private. Michael never boasted about his job or his house. He didn't need to. He believed in living with dignity and letting his work speak for itself. People respected that, even if they sometimes wished they could know him better. Life in the community moved in slow rhythm. The gardeners came in the morning. The children came back from school in the afternoon, and families walked together in the evenings. There was a lake nearby where ducks floated lazily, and a park where the community held little fairs or outdoor movie nights. Michael didn't attend often, but when he did, people were glad to see him. They felt safer knowing someone like him lived among them. The Homeowners Association, known as the HOA, often organized meetings to discuss the rules of the neighborhood. Michael rarely attended unless the matters were serious. He trusted that the others could handle day-to-day concerns. For him, the mansion was a place of retreat, a space where the noise of the world could not reach. He had seen enough conflict and argument in his courtroom. At home, he wanted peace. His mansion itself was a picture of balance. The walls painted a soft cream, the windows tall and bright, the garden cared for with neat hedges and colorful flowers. Inside, there were shelves filled with books, paintings that told stories of history and justice, and a quiet study with a heavy oak desk. That room was his sanctuary. It was where he thought, where he read, and sometimes where he found comfort after long days in court. Even though he kept to himself, Michael was not unkind. If a neighbor asked for advice, he gave it. If someone needed help, he offered it. Once he even lent his gardener to an older couple when their lawn grew too much for them to manage. He believed that kindness did not have to be loud. It only had to be real, and people never forgot his small acts. The peace of the neighborhood was something Michael held close to his heart. He had seen the darker sides of human nature in his courtroom. He had seen greed, anger, lies, and betrayal. He knew how ugly people could become when they wanted something that was not theirs. That was why he loved coming home. Here he felt surrounded by honesty, by trust, by the gentle flow of ordinary life. It reminded him that not all people were like the ones he judged in court. Still, there were always little signs of tension. The HOA sometimes quarreled over decorations, over noise, or over small things like paint colors. But none of that reached Michael's gates. He let it all pass like clouds drifting in the sky. What mattered to him was his peace, his work, and his quiet evenings. He thought it would always remain that way, untouched. The community saw him as the symbol of stability. If Michael was calm, they felt calm too. They thought of him as the man who carried wisdom, but never flaunted it. The man who lived in the mansion at the end of the road but never made others feel small. To them, he was more than a neighbor. He was the silent guardian of their peaceful world. Michael never imagined that this peace could be disturbed. Not in such a perfect neighborhood. Not by the people he thought he could trust. To him, the mansion was unshakable. The community was steady and life was simple. He didn't know that behind the smiles and polite greetings. Someone was already planning to test the limits of his patience and the strength of his calm life. Someone who would turn his sanctuary into a stage for deception. Karen was the kind of neighbor everyone knew. Not because she was warm or kind, but because her presence filled every corner of the community. She was the president of the HOA, and she carried that title like a crown on her head. If a mailbox was the wrong shade of brown, Karen noticed. If a lawn was too long by an inch, Karen sent a letter. Some called her dedicated, others called her controlling. But nobody denied that she had power. She had lived in the neighborhood for years, and she treated it as if it were her personal kingdom. Her word at HOA meetings often became the final word. She loved standing at the front of the room, flipping through papers, and reminding people of the rules she had helped create. Most neighbors sighed and went along. It was easier that way, and besides, arguing with Karen felt like walking into a storm you could never win. One afternoon, she came to Michael's mansion, dressed neatly, carrying a smile that seemed just a little too polished. Michael welcomed her politely, offering her a seat on the porch. Karen wasted no time. She leaned forward, hands folded, and explained her reason for visiting. Her niece, she said, was getting married soon. It was a joyous occasion, but they had run into trouble. The wedding venue had been canceled at the last minute. Her niece was devastated. The family was desperate, and that was when she thought of Michael's beautiful home. She described his mansion's garden with words that made it sound like a fairy tale. The wide lawn, the fountain, the tall trees. She said it would be the perfect place for a small ceremony. Nothing loud, nothing messy, just a gentle gathering of family and friends. She promised it would not trouble him at all. They would clean everything. They would be respectful. She even placed a hand over her heart, saying it was only for one day. Michael listened quietly. He was not the type to interrupt. He knew that people often revealed themselves if you let them talk long enough. Karen's voice carried excitement, but behind it he sensed a hint of calculation. Still, the request sounded neighborly enough, and Michael had no reason to refuse. After all, it was just a wedding, a single day, and helping a family in need felt like the right thing to do, so he agreed with a calm nod. Karen's smile widened, almost too wide. She thanked him over and over, her words spilling out like coins from a broken jar. She promised it would be simple, quiet, and respectful. She promised she would personally make sure nothing was out of place. She even said the neighbors would admire his generosity, that they would see him as not just a judge, but a man of kindness. Michael simply replied that it was fine, that he wished her niece well, and that was the end of the conversation. Or so he thought as Karen left the mansion. Her steps were light, her eyes gleamed. She had gotten what she wanted, but her mind was already racing. She was not thinking of her niece's happiness as much as she was thinking of herself. She imagined the looks on people's faces when they arrived at the mansion. She imagined standing at the center, guiding vendors, greeting guests, all in front of the grand estate. She imagined people whispering about how impressive she looked, about how powerful she must be to host such an event. Over the next few days, Karen was seen moving around the neighborhood with unusual energy. She called vendors, she spoke with neighbors, and she dropped small comments about the upcoming wedding. Her words were carefully chosen. She never directly said the mansion was hers, but she hinted in ways that made people assume. She talked about her garden looking perfect for photos and ice, or the fountain at her place being just right for the ceremony. Neighbors nodded politely, some confused, but nobody dared challenge her. Meanwhile, Michael returned to his peaceful routine. He didn't think much of it. He trusted Karen's words, and he believed people would respect his home. He had no idea that the event was growing larger than promised. No idea that Karen was painting a picture in people's minds where she stood as the lady of the estate. He simply thought he had done a kind favor for a neighbor, one that would pass quietly. But Karen was not the type to let a stage go to waste. In her mind, this wedding was not just for her niece. It was for her. It was her chance to shine, to place herself at the center of attention, to stand in front of the mansion and feel like it belonged to her, even if just for a day. She told herself she deserved it after all. She was the one who worked hardest for the community. She was the one who made the rules. Why shouldn't she enjoy the spotlight? What Karen didn't realize was that Michael's quiet nature was not weakness. His calm agreement was not blindness. He had spent years watching people in court, listening to their excuses, hearing their tricks. He had learned to recognize when words didn't match intentions, and though he said little, he had noticed the shine in Karen's eyes. He had noticed the eagerness that seemed to go beyond a simple family request. He didn't say anything, not yet, but a part of him wondered how far she might take it. For Karen, the stage was set. In her mind, the wedding was not just an event. It was the opening act of something bigger, something grander. She didn't see Michael as a man helping his neighbor. She saw him as a background piece, part of the scenery for her performance, and as the day of the wedding drew closer, her ambition began to grow, stretching beyond what anyone would have guessed. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, the kind of day people prayed for when planning such events. The sun hung in the sky like a soft lantern. The air smelled of fresh flowers, and the sound of distant birds filled the quiet neighborhood. Michael stood on his porch for a moment, sipping his tea. Watching as trucks and vans began pulling up in front of his gates, it seemed more than he expected. Far more. He had agreed to a small gathering, a few chairs in the garden, perhaps a simple arch for the ceremony. But what he saw was different. Delivery men carried crates of decorations. Florists brought buckets of roses, lilies, and orchids. Tents were being unfolded. Long tables dragged across his lawn. Michael raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He wanted to see how Karen's promises measured against her actions. Soon guests began to arrive, cars lined the streets. Music played softly through hidden speakers. Laughter echoed as people in elegant clothes stepped into the garden. But what surprised Michael most was the way Karen presented herself. She was not moving quietly in the background as a grateful neighbor should. She was standing tall, giving instructions with confidence. Waving her hand as if she owned the place, her voice rang out. "Put the arch closer to the fountain, yes. It looks better there. Or make sure the tables face the house. People need the best view." Michael walked through his mansion calmly, observing from the windows to the guests. It seemed as if Karen was the hostess. Her posture, her words, her tone left little room for doubt. She welcomed people warmly, introducing herself with pride, and when some asked about the stunning estate, she smiled in a way that suggested ownership. "Oh yes, it's perfect for these kinds of occasions," she said. "I knew it would work beautifully," never directly claiming it, but never correcting anyone either. As the ceremony began, chairs filled with guests. The bride walked down the aisle under the arch covered in flowers. People whispered about how magical the mansion looked, how grand the setting was, and how lucky Karen's family must be. Michael, standing quietly near the back, heard the comments and noticed how Karen never once mentioned his name. To them, he was invisible, just another face in the crowd. A man wandering his own garden unnoticed, it struck him as ironic. A judge who spent his life making truth visible was now hidden in plain sight within his own home, and yet he remained calm. He had no desire to interrupt the happiness of the bride and groom. Their day should not suffer because of Karen's games. Still, he watched closely, his eyes sharp, his mind recording every word, every gesture, the way Karen carried herself like a queen of the mansion she did not own. When the vows were spoken and applause filled the air, Karen walked proudly beside the couple as if she were the host, guiding them toward the reception area where food and drinks waited. She clinked glasses, gave little speeches, and accepted compliments that weren't hers. One guest even laughed and said, "Karen, you've outdone yourself. This house is breathtaking," to which she simply replied with a modest shrug. "Well, I do what I can." Michael heard it all, his jaw tightening slightly. Hours passed, the music grew louder, the laughter fuller. And though Michael had expected a quiet gathering, what unfolded looked more like a grand celebration. His mansion had become a stage for Karen's performance, and she was the star yet in the middle of all this. Michael noticed something else, a hunger in her eyes, a satisfaction that went beyond helping her niece. It was as though she believed this moment was her rightful place, as though she were convincing not just the guests, but herself, that the mansion should belong to her. By evening, the sun dipped low. Lanterns and string lights illuminated the garden. People danced on the lawn. Children ran around the fountain. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Karen walked among them with pride, her hand brushing the stone pillars, her voice loud. Calling it the heart of the neighborhood, Michael, seated quietly in the corner, almost invisible, felt the weight of her deception pressing heavier with each passing moment. He could have stepped forward. He could have cleared his throat and reminded everyone who the true owner was, but he did not. Years in court had taught him that sometimes the best way to see the truth of a person was to let them speak freely, let them expose themselves without interruption. And tonight Karen was speaking louder than ever without realizing it. As the last guest began to leave, many thanked Karen warmly. Some even asked if she would consider hosting other events. She smiled, her eyes shining, giving no sign that the house was not hers to offer. The bride and groom hugged her tightly, whispering words of gratitude, while Michael, standing quietly in the background, received nothing more than polite nods from a few who assumed he was some distant relative. When the lights dimmed and the music faded, Karen stood in the garden with a glass in her hand, gazing at the mansion with a look that Michael recognized. It was not appreciation, it was possession. She looked at it as if it was hers already, and for the first time that evening Michael felt a deep stillness inside. He knew this was no ordinary neighborly favor. This was the beginning of something much larger, something he would need to confront, but for now he said nothing. He closed the heavy doors of his mansion behind him, letting Karen bask in her illusion a little longer after all. He had learned that truth revealed itself best when arrogance went unchecked, and Karen's arrogance was only just beginning to show its full face. The wedding was over, the lights were taken down, the chairs stacked and the vendors gone, but the echo of the day lingered in the neighborhood. People talked about it for weeks, how beautiful the setting was, how grand the house looked, and how Karen seemed to glow as if she had stepped into her rightful place. Whispers spread quietly, as whispers always do, and before long many neighbors began to believe that Karen had hosted the wedding in her own estate. Michael noticed this almost immediately. He would walk through the neighborhood in the mornings, greeting people as usual, but instead of talking about their gardens or the weather, they now smiled politely and asked if Karen's house was always that stunning inside. Some even complimented him for attending. Assuming he was just a guest or perhaps a distant family member, he gave no answer, only a slight smile, but inside he felt a sharp clarity. The wedding had been more than a family event. It had been a stage for Karen's story. Neighbors began congratulating Karen openly, some at the local park. Others during HOA meetings, they said things like, "Your place was the perfect venue," or "That mansion of yours really impressed everyone." Karen never corrected them. She simply laughed modestly, waving her hand as if brushing away a compliment she secretly craved. Each time she avoided the truth, she grew bolder. Each time she accepted false praise, her confidence deepened. Michael remained quiet, but he listened carefully. He observed how quickly a lie could grow when it was watered by pride and silence. Karen had not yet claimed the mansion outright, but she had planted the seed in the minds of the community, and now it was sprouting. People were beginning to see her not just as the HOA president, but as the woman who lived in the grandest house of all. Behind the scenes, Karen began weaving her story more carefully. She invited small groups of neighbors for tea, hosting them at her own modest home but speaking at length about her garden and her fountain. She told tales about the struggles of maintaining such a large property, sighing dramatically as if the weight of ownership rested on her shoulders. The guests nodded, sympathetic and impressed. They carried her words back to others, and the story spread even further. Michael, from his study window, could see the subtle shift in the way people looked at him, not with disrespect but with uncertainty. Some were no longer sure who he really was. They didn't ask openly, but their eyes lingered. Their voices carried hesitation, as if they were trying to place him. He was no longer the respected judge with the mansion. He was the quiet man who just happened to live at the end of the road, while Karen stood in the center, weaving illusions. One evening, Michael attended an HOA meeting. Sitting in the back as usual, Karen stood at the front, flipping through papers, her voice carrying authority. Midway through the meeting, a neighbor brought up the wedding, complimenting her again, saying how wonderful it was that she could open her estate for such a beautiful occasion. Karen smiled sweetly, thanking them without once correcting the assumption. She then shifted smoothly into a discussion about neighborhood pride, about how important it was that the community maintained its highest standards, and everyone nodded, their respect for her growing deeper. Michael sat silently, his hands folded but his eyes sharp. He understood now that Karen's actions were deliberate. She was not simply enjoying the praise of a misunderstanding. She was feeding it, nurturing it, shaping it into something larger. She was turning his silence into her foundation, and his home into her story. In private, Michael began to notice smaller details. Karen driving past his mansion more often, slowing down as if checking on something she owned. Karen speaking to vendors in the neighborhood, casually dropping lines like, "When I need flowers at my place," or "I'm planning something big next season." Her words painted a picture. Her confidence polished the frame, and before long the community was seeing it clearly. But what Karen didn't know was that Michael's patience was not weakness. He was a man of the law, and he had seen people like her many times. People who believed their cleverness could twist reality, who thought that confidence could replace truth. He knew how their stories ended, not in triumph but in collapse. Still, he allowed her to continue, watching closely, recording quietly, waiting for the moment when her ambition would push her too far. The turning point came when a neighbor casually mentioned to Michael that Karen had spoken of future plans for the mansion. Michael asked politely what they meant, and the neighbor explained that Karen had hinted she might open her estate for more community events. Perhaps fundraisers, perhaps larger gatherings. She had spoken as though it were hers to decide, as though the gates and the garden were hers to offer. Michael felt the calm shift inside him. The line was being crossed, yet he did not confront her immediately. He knew confrontation too early would only create noise. What he needed was clarity, undeniable evidence, and the right moment. Until then he remained silent, appearing calm and detached. But inside he was watching with the precision of a judge, weighing every word, every rumor, every whisper that passed through the neighborhood. Karen, however, saw none of this. She mistook his silence for surrender, his patience for weakness in her mind. The mansion was already half hers. All she needed was the right push, the right document, the right move to make the illusion permanent, and she was bold enough to believe she could do it. As the weeks passed, the whispers became conversations, and the conversations became quiet beliefs. The story of Karen and her mansion was taking root. Michael knew it was no longer just a lie. It was becoming a weapon, one that Karen would soon turn against him directly. And when that happened, he would be ready. Karen's whispers had done their job. The neighbors already spoke of the mansion as though it were hers, and the lie had grown strong roots, but for Karen it was not enough. Lies alone would not make the house hers. She wanted more than admiration. She wanted control, and in her world, control always began with paperwork and rules. As HOA president, Karen had more influence than most people realized. She could shape regulations. She could push for votes. She could plant ideas into the board's discussions until they seemed natural. So she began her campaign slowly, bringing up the subject of property boundaries at meetings, suggesting that certain homes, especially the larger ones, should be examined for compliance. Her voice carried authority, and her suggestions often became tasks. Soon she began dropping hints about Michael's mansion. Speaking as if it might have hidden problems, she mentioned rumors of old ownership disputes, of possible zoning errors. Her words were casual, spoken with a smile, but they were seeds, and the board members, though hesitant, began to listen. After all, Karen always spoke with such confidence that people assumed she knew what she was talking about. At the same time, Karen began spreading stories in the community, saying things like, that mansion has a complicated history, or some people believe it wasn't properly registered. The more she repeated these lines, the more people began to wonder, and wonder quickly turned into doubt. Michael noticed the change. He saw how some neighbors' eyes flickered with suspicion when they looked at him, as if they were asking questions they didn't dare voice. Karen was clever. She didn't accuse him directly. She wrapped her lies in layers of concern. "I just want what's fair for the community," she said at one meeting. "We need to make sure all properties follow the rules, even the largest ones." She pretended to be acting for the good of everyone, but in truth she was laying the ground for her boldest move. That move came when Karen approached the HOA board with a thick folder in her hands. She placed it on the table with a theatrical sigh, flipping through the pages. Inside were documents she claimed to have found. Old records that supposedly questioned Michael's ownership. She argued that there were gaps in the paperwork, signatures that looked suspicious, dates that didn't line up. She said it with the confidence of someone who believed her own lies. The board members sat in silence, uneasy, but unsure how to challenge her. Michael was not present that day. He rarely attended unless the matters were urgent. But word of Karen's presentation reached him quickly. A neighbor mentioned it in passing, eyes wide with curiosity. "She brought files? She says something's wrong with your deed," they told him. Michael listened quietly, his face calm, but inside a sharper stillness took hold. He now knew Karen's whispers had turned into a direct strike. Karen did not stop there. She began contacting people outside the neighborhood, hinting to local officials that the mansion might have legal issues. She even suggested that it could be tied up in fraud. Her voice carried false concern, but her intentions were clear. She wanted the story to spread. She wanted doubt to grow so large that it weakened Michael's claim in the eyes of others. And once that happened, she believed she could slide in with her own claim. She even started bragging in private conversations, telling close allies that she was working on something big, that soon the community would see her as more than the HOA president. They would see her as the rightful lady of the mansion. She spoke with the excitement of someone who thought victory was close. Her ambition was no longer hidden. It was written across her face. Meanwhile, Michael watched in silence. His years as a judge had taught him not to react too quickly. He collected information instead. Neighbors who had heard Karen's words, people who had seen her documents, even board members who whispered uneasily about her push for power. He gathered it all without saying much. To him, this was not just about his house anymore. It was about justice. It was about a woman who thought lies could replace truth, and he knew exactly where lies always ended. What Karen didn't understand was that Michael's silence was not ignorance. It was preparation. Each false rumor she spread, each document she waved, each whisper she planted, he recorded it all like evidence in a case. He knew her moves would eventually lead her into territory where she could not escape, and when that moment came, he would not simply defend himself. He would expose her completely. But Karen, blinded by ambition, grew bolder. At the next HOA meeting, she suggested that the board consider temporary oversight of the mansion until the questions about ownership were cleared. She framed it as a community safeguard, but the implication was clear. She wanted control, even partial control, of Michael's property. Gasps filled the room. But Karen stood firm, her chin high, her eyes gleaming with the belief that she was untouchable. Michael, sitting quietly in his study that night, looked around at his shelves of law books, at the desk where he had signed judgments that shaped lives, at the walls lined with memories of battles fought and won in the courtroom. He knew exactly what Karen was trying to do, and he also knew that she had just stepped past the point of no return. The game was no longer whispers. It was now a legal challenge, and in the world of law, Michael was not just another neighbor. He was the judge. For now he kept his calm, sipping his tea as if nothing had changed. But inside he was preparing, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen countless schemes crumble under the weight of truth. Karen thought she was building her empire, but all she was really doing was tightening the rope around her own neck, and Michael was patient enough to let her pull it tighter. Michael had spent most of his life listening to lawyers argue, listening to witnesses twist their words, listening to guilty men try to sound innocent. In court he had learned that patience revealed the truth more clearly than force ever could. Now sitting in his mansion, he knew that patience would serve him again. Karen thought she was clever, but Michael had already begun his quiet investigation. He did not storm into HOA meetings to confront her. He did not raise his voice or threaten legal action. Instead, he took notes, neat and precise, every word she spoke in public, every rumor that drifted back to him from the neighbors. He treated each piece of gossip like evidence because in his eyes it was. Karen believed she was writing her story of triumph, but Michael was compiling her case of fraud. The first step he took was simple. He went down to the county clerk's office where public records were stored. He requested every file connected to his property, the original deed, the sales history, the tax records, all of it. The clerks knew him, respected him, and provided the documents quickly. Michael sat at a long wooden table in the dusty office, flipping through the pages carefully. He confirmed what he already knew. Every signature was correct, every date in order, every tax bill paid. The mansion was his beyond question, but then he checked the recent activity, and that was where Karen's shadow appeared. Someone had tried to file a claim, a weak, sloppy attempt to challenge ownership. The name attached to the paperwork was Karen's. She had used her position in the HOA as leverage, writing in exaggerated language about unclear boundaries and disputed rights. The clerk had dismissed it quickly, but the fact remained. Karen had tried to create an official doubt, and that meant she had crossed from whispers into fraud. Michael returned home with the papers, sliding them into a folder he kept locked in his study. He did not feel anger. He felt a calm certainty. He had the proof now. The question was how to use it. As a judge, he had seen many people ruin themselves by moving too soon, by striking without preparation. Karen was still dancing on her stage, still believing the mansion was within her reach. Michael decided to let her keep dancing a little longer, because the higher she climbed on her illusion, the harder she would fall in the meantime. He began speaking quietly to the neighbors, not with accusations but with questions. He asked what Karen had told them, how she had described the wedding, what she said about the mansion afterward. People spoke freely, some embarrassed, some angry. They realized they had been misled, and they admitted how Karen had hinted at ownership without ever saying it outright. Michael listened carefully, noting each story, each timeline, each name. He was building a chain of truth that would be impossible to break. Karen, however, believed she was winning. She walked through the neighborhood with new confidence, her voice louder, her claims bolder. She told people she was working on finalizing things, as if the mansion were already hers. She spoke about repainting the walls, about opening the garden for tours. She even suggested she might rent the place out for special events. The audacity grew each day, and with it, So did Michael's file of evidence late at night. Michael sat in his study under the glow of a lamp, reading through his notes, cross-checking the documents, aligning the stories. It was no different from preparing for trial. He knew Karen would eventually take the final step, pushing her false claim into legal channels, and when she did, he would be ready, not as her neighbor, but as the judge who had spent his life tearing apart lies. What fascinated him most was the way Karen revealed herself through her arrogance. She mistook silence for surrender, patience for weakness. In her mind, she had already conquered. She did not see the trap she was building for herself, a trap made from her own words, her own actions, her own signatures on fraudulent papers. Michael did not need to trick her. She was tricking herself. Days turned into weeks, and each day Karen's confidence grew. She spoke to the HOA about protecting community assets. She hinted at organizing events at the mansion without Michael's permission. She even bragged to a few close friends that soon she would hold the keys to the grandest home in town. Her laughter echoed across lawns, and people began to feel uneasy. Some still believed her, but others quietly turned toward Michael, waiting to see what he would do. Michael remained calm. He tended to his garden. He greeted neighbors politely. He walked his halls with quiet dignity. To anyone watching, it seemed as though nothing had changed, but inside his mind every detail was sharp. Every piece of evidence in place, he knew the moment was approaching. The moment when Karen would step into court with her false claims, believing she had cornered him. And that was when the truth would finally speak for Michael. The investigation was not only about defending his home, it was about defending the principle that lies could never replace truth, that arrogance could never replace law. He had seen too many people fall into ruin because they believed they were smarter than the system. Karen was no different. She thought her charm, her authority, her confidence could carry her through, but Michael knew better. He had the patience, he had the evidence, and most importantly, he had the law on his side, and so he waited, letting Karen continue her performance, letting her believe the mansion was already hers, while behind the scenes he prepared the stage for her downfall, the stage where she would finally face the truth, not in whispers, not in meetings, but in a courtroom where the mask of arrogance would shatter under the weight of evidence. The day arrived when Karen's ambition carried her farther than she had ever gone before. She had filed her claims, submitted her so-called documents, and stirred enough doubt that the matter was scheduled to be heard in court. To her, this was victory already. She dressed sharply that morning, wearing a suit that made her feel powerful. Her head held high as she walked into the courthouse, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She believed this was the moment she would finally take the mansion as her own. She imagined herself walking out of the building with whispers of admiration following her. Imagined neighbors looking at her with awe. Imagined the HOA bowing to her authority even more than before. To her, this was not just a legal matter. It was the final chapter of her rise. She thought Michael would be caught off guard, that he would scramble to defend himself, that he would stumble before her confidence. She thought she had already won. The courtroom was full that day. Word had spread quickly in the community, and many curious neighbors had come to watch. The seats were filled with people whispering quietly, some supporting Karen, others skeptical but eager to see what would happen. The air buzzed with tension, and Karen thrived on it. She smiled, shook hands, and carried herself like a woman who had nothing to fear. When the bailiff called for order and the doors opened for the judge, Karen rose with everyone else, her confidence shining. But the moment she saw who walked in, her world cracked. It was Michael, the very man she had tried to deceive, the very man she had painted as weak and silent, the man whose home she had claimed as her own. He was not sitting at a defense table. He was standing in the highest seat of authority, wearing the robe of a judge, his expression calm, his eyes steady. Karen's face froze, her breath caught. Her hands gripped the table. For a moment, the room spun around her. She had expected an easy battle, but now she realized she was standing before a man who had spent his life tearing down lies. The neighbors in the gallery gasped softly, some leaning forward, some covering their mouths. The shock of the moment rippled through the room like a wave. Michael's voice filled the courtroom, calm, steady, and unshakable. He began with the usual formalities, but every word carried a quiet weight, the kind of weight that reminded everyone present that truth. Not arrogance ruled this space. Karen tried to compose herself, adjusting her papers, forcing a smile, but her confidence had cracked and Michael could see it clearly. As the hearing began, Karen tried to present her case. She held up her folder of documents, speaking in the same confident tone she used at HOA meetings. She claimed there were errors in Michael's deed. She insisted the ownership was unclear. She even suggested that the mansion should be temporarily placed under community control. Her voice was loud, but it trembled slightly. Betraying her unease, Michael listened quietly, his eyes never leaving her when she finished. He leaned forward and began asking questions, his words precise, sharp, and calm. He asked where she had obtained her documents, who had verified them, why the dates and signatures did not match the official records. Karen stammered, trying to explain, but the more she spoke, the more tangled her lies became. Each question cut deeper. Each answer revealed cracks in her story. Then Michael revealed his evidence. He presented the official records from the county clerk, complete, accurate, and undeniable. He showed the history of the property, the taxes paid, the signatures verified. He showed Karen's recent attempt to file fraudulent claims. Stamped and dismissed, the courtroom grew silent as the truth became clear. Karen had not uncovered an error. She had tried to create one, and she had been caught. Neighbors in the gallery exchanged shocked looks. Whispers filled the air. Some stared at Karen with disbelief, others with anger. They realized they had been misled, that she had used their trust for her own gain. Karen's face burned red, her hands shook, her voice faltered. The confident queen of the HOA now looked like a child caught stealing. Michael's tone remained calm but firm. He explained how Karen's actions were not only dishonest but dangerous, how attempting to falsify ownership documents was a serious matter, how abusing her position as HOA president to spread lies had harmed the community. His words were not loud, but they carried the finality of judgment. Each sentence landed like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Karen tried one last time to defend herself, her words tumbling out in desperation. She claimed she had only been trying to protect the neighborhood, that she had misunderstood the documents, that she had been misinformed, but nobody believed her anymore. Her performance had ended, and the truth stood bare. Michael delivered his ruling with steady authority. Karen's claims were dismissed completely, her documents declared fraudulent. Her conduct referred for further investigation. She was ordered to pay fines, and her position as HOA president was stripped from her immediately. The courtroom echoed with the sound of his gavel, the sound of finality, the sound of truth winning over lies. Karen slumped in her chair, her shoulders heavy, her eyes wide with disbelief. The neighbors filed out quietly, their whispers sharp, their trust in her broken. Michael remained calm, removing his robe and gathering his papers. He did not gloat, he did not smile. He simply stood as he always had, dignified and steady. For him, it was not about revenge. It was about justice. As Karen left the courtroom, her once confident steps now slow and shaky, she realized the empire she had built on lies had crumbled in front of everyone. She had wanted to steal a mansion, but instead she had lost everything, and the man she had underestimated, the man she thought was silent and weak, had shown her the true power of patience, truth, and the law. The courthouse had emptied, but the echo of the verdict traveled quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, almost everyone knew what had happened. The whispers that once painted Karen as the proud owner of the mansion had transformed into whispers of shock and disappointment. Neighbors shook their heads as they told the story. The woman who once commanded meetings, who once scolded others for small mistakes, had been caught trying to steal what was never hers. Karen walked home with her shoulders slumped, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her with every step. She could feel the stares from windows, the silence of those who once smiled politely at her. Even the air seemed colder. The crown she had placed on her own head had shattered, and now she was only the woman who lied, who pretended, who fell. At the next HOA meeting, the room was full, but Karen was not at the front. She sat quietly in the back, her eyes lowered, stripped of her title, stripped of her power. The board had voted to remove her, citing her abuse of authority. The neighbors who once clapped for her speeches now avoided her gaze, some angry, some embarrassed, some simply tired of her arrogance. Her voice, once the loudest in the room, had been reduced to silence. Michael attended that meeting too, but he did not gloat. He did not stand to remind anyone of what had happened. He simply sat calmly, nodding when others looked his way, his dignity intact, his presence steady. The neighbors felt comfort in that. They saw that he was not a man seeking revenge. He was a man who allowed truth to do the work. His strength was quiet, but it carried more weight than all of Karen's noise ever had. In the days that followed, people began stopping by his mansion, not to assume ownership, not to question him, but to apologize. Some admitted they had believed Karen's lies. Others said they had doubted him when they should have trusted. Michael accepted their words with kindness, telling them it was natural to be misled when someone speaks with confidence. He did not hold grudges. He believed that forgiveness was a stronger lesson than anger. The community changed after that. There was less gossip, less blind trust in bold voices. People became more careful, more thoughtful. They realized how easily they had been swept up in illusions, and they respected Michael more than ever. He was no longer just the man with the mansion. He was the neighbor who carried himself with patience and honor, the man who let truth speak louder than pride. Karen, however, became a shadow of her former self. Her name spoken with pity rather than admiration. Some neighbors avoided her completely. Others offered polite nods, but nothing more. She had lost not only her position, but her reputation. Her attempt to seize the mansion had destroyed the small power she once held. She was left with nothing but the memory of her own arrogance. Michael, meanwhile, returned to his peaceful routine. His evenings on the porch, his mornings in the garden, his books, his tea, his quiet walks. He had no need to celebrate or boast. The mansion was his, as it always had been, but now it stood as more than just a home. It was a reminder that truth, no matter how quietly it waits, always rises above lies. Sometimes as he walked through the neighborhood, he would pass by Karen. Their eyes would meet briefly, hers filled with regret, his calm and steady. He never spoke harshly to her, never reminded her of her fall. He did not need to. The silence between them carried all the weight of what had been revealed. The neighbors often recalled the day in court. The moment Karen's confidence shattered, the moment Michael's calm authority filled the room. They spoke of it as a lesson, a warning against pride and greed. Children heard their parents telling the story and learned that truth cannot be stolen, that respect cannot be faked, that power built on lies always collapses. For Michael, life returned to what it had always been, peaceful, steady, grounded in truth. But for the community, something had changed forever. They had seen how far arrogance could go, how quickly lies could spread, and how one man's patience could bring it all to light. And so the mansion at the end of the road remained what it always was, a home built on hard work and honesty. Untouched by schemes, untarnished by lies, it stood tall, not as a prize to be stolen, but as a symbol of quiet strength, of dignity, of truth. And Michael, sitting on his porch in the evening light, knew that peace had returned, not because the storm had never come, but because he had let it pass, leaving the truth shining brighter than before.